Hello, hello. This is Irene with SaugaTalks. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. I'm sure you're aware that we're on LinkedIn, on X, we're on YouTube. So I'm Irene Lyakovetsky. I'm speaking with fascinating people in tech, and we cover a whole range of technology topics, all the way from AI innovation, GenAI for sure, automation, digital transformation. So tune in for fascinating people being generous in my studio, speaking about data advantages, speaking about AI future, speaking about technology trend. And today is my day because Jim Liddle is here. Jim, how are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you so very much for joining, because the topic we announced, right? It's about data, but I want to talk about data and fueling AI innovation this year, because it seems like to me so much going on. So much going on. So enterprise architect, professional, business people, right? They know the basic, right? Everyone seems to be using their data. And yet you yourself as a leader, as practitioner, I cannot wait to hear from you. What are the data advantages for companies, for enterprises in 2024?
Sure. Yeah, happy to speak about that. I think the data question is an interesting question. Actually, not even just from the enterprise, but also from the AI vendors themselves. We've seen that as they look to train new models, that they're looking obviously to procure data sets. I think what we've seen over the last 12 months is that the provenance of data has become important for those AI foundational models. And a lot of the vendors now seem to be entering into licensing deals with other vendors, like Reddit and WordPress and others, to actually be able to prove the provenance of the data that goes into the foundational model. And that actually bleeds down into enterprise, because when companies use these foundational models, they want to have some guarantees around the provenance of the data, and to make sure that they're using trusted data sets inside of those foundational models. So I think that actually is the first step. And the other thing that's been interesting, as we've seen some of the more license-friendly AI vendors, some of those now have started to even bundle the checkpoint training data along with the models. So to make it even easier for the enterprise to kind of know the provenance, and even to get the checkpoint data, so that they add their data into that. So I think that's the first interesting thing I've seen in the last 12 months. Training data provenance has become very important. Training data procurement from those AI vendors has become a really hot topic. And I think from the enterprise point of view, what I see is that in general, I don't think the enterprise is as mature as probably a lot of people think in terms of their adoption of AI. I still think that they're feeling their way into that. Part of the challenge around that is just the rate of innovation in that space. The models are changing so quickly. New vendors are releasing new models so quickly. The number of models that's been released is phenomenal in the last 12 months. I mean, we've got thousands of models now on things like Hugging Face. The number of new vendors that have come through. We've even seen, models retired. GPT-3 recently was retired. So, people who actually went into that, AI as a service space early and started to embrace AI would likely have to fine tune their data against a brand new model, like a 3.5 or a 4, because, the life cycle management of AI is kicked in very, very quickly. And I think in some ways that inhibits, the use of AI as much as, the data governance and the security and hallucinations and all of those other things that we hear about. The fact that rate of innovation is so quick, it not only does it confuse, the issue in the enterprise, it also adds in an inhibitor to actually being able to, really get on with some of those AI projects.
So can we maybe talk a little bit, not the whole time today, but about GenAI, okay? Because I speak with my guests, I subscribe to a number of sources, right? Trying to keep in touch with the latest and greatest. I hear that value is yet to be realized with all the potential of GenAI, especially in enterprise.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think the GenAI use cases have yet to be really realized in the enterprise. I think the real low-hanging fruit for the enterprise right now is what I would call the institutional knowledge use case. And that's the ability to interact with institutional knowledge that normally is kind of dark data, unstructured data that gets lost quite quickly because of the amount of it that's kind of collated over like a month. The amount of data that actually goes into the unstructured data repository inside of an enterprise is a lot. So I think it's true that the GenAI use case is probably not as precedent as we would like to think in the enterprise today. Certainly that institutional knowledge use case is something that a business can get traction with very quickly, both internally for internal knowledge bases and externally for kind of sales and support chatbots against knowledge bases. And I see a lot of traction around those use cases. And I see a lot of tools, being made easier for enterprises to be able to consume those types of use cases. And when I say that, I'm thinking about things like, Microsoft Copilot Studio, Amazon Q, tools where you don't really have to code to take advantage of AI. You can configure, and you can go a long way, to be able to leverage some of the knowledge you have internally to be able to interact and chat with it. In terms of the pure play GenAI use cases, I do see some of those for sure. We have customers in the AEC space, and the AEC space does a lot of requests for proposals, a lot of tenders. The ability to be able to learn from prior tenders to create new tenders is certainly one of the GenAI use cases that I see, that people would like to crack. And that's to do, with a few things. It's to do with scale. How many tenders can we actually, respond to? GenAI, if implemented correctly, could make that, much quicker and scale better. And there are some other nuances around use cases like that, such as, for example, I was speaking to one vendor who said that when they do variations of tenders, they actually have a bigger success rate. But creating variations of tenders is quite onerous to do and time consuming. So it's very difficult to do that with every tender. When you automate that business process by underpinning it with data, and use GenAI, obviously you can scale that much better, and you can start to think about doing things like responding to variations of tenders, which makes your success rate much better, and ultimately leads to more dollars and revenue into the business. And I do see some of those GenAI use cases, but to be honest with you, I think I don't see how many, at least today, have been implemented. I think, as I said earlier, I think a lot of companies right now are evaluating AI. They're looking at the hyperscalers because that's where most of their relationships are. They're figuring out which AI platform that they want to partner with. They're actually doing their own due diligence around some of those platforms. And of course, there is, a big security element. There is the element of provenance of training data, like we talked about earlier. There's some of the copyright issues that are floating around. There is, in most of these big enterprises, using AI systems has to be signed off by the CISO or the CISO's group. So there's all of those steps that you have to go through to start to be able to implement some of those AI projects. I am seeing a mix of models. I would say initially, a lot of those models were cloud-based models. I am starting to see some of those now, those private models actually, being used for certain, more secular use cases. But in general, I would agree with the statement you said at the beginning, which was there doesn't seem to be as much of that GenAI, work in the enterprise actually precedent right now. And I'd agree with that. I would say that right now, the biggest use cases I see is still the traditional, interact with knowledge base type institutional knowledge chatbot use case.
When we're talking about AI and data, all right, I myself, sometimes get so excited about these new use cases, the shiny toy we're all playing, and we want to think, how enterprises will start implementing those. But at the same time, let's not forget about infrastructure, okay? It's not into your face, right? But what kind of flexible and scalable infrastructure company would need to think about? Is it cloud element, absolutely, right? It's mainstream now. Is it edge computer? What are the general considerations you think to achieve that business value we talked about?
Well, I think from a company who wants to leverage their unstructured data set with AI today, they've got a number of choices as to how to do that. At one end of the scale, you've got full model training, where you're training either a new model or basing it off a foundational model to train your data set, your corporate data set. And then, the next step down, we've probably got fine tuning, in which you're actually complementing a foundational model with some of your data set. And then we've got things like inferencing, more around the analytics use cases. And then we've got things like retrieval augmented generation and RAG-based apps, where you're effectively creating a separate knowledge base, with a RAG pipeline to leverage a back-end LLM. And each of those have different infrastructure requirements. On the at least on the retrieval augmented generation side, the infrastructure requirements are probably less. It's more around what you need in terms of your embedding models, your vector model, your vector database, what the LLM is and how you're going to construct the pipeline, etc. At the other end of the spectrum, if you're thinking about doing model training, then you're in the land of looking at dedicated hardware, be that cloud or be on premise, and GPUs and CUDA and things of that nature, and that is much more of a heavy lift. And the challenge around that right now is everybody is grabbing those GPUs, particularly on cloud, particularly the high performance ones. So it's not a given, even if you wanted to start a project tomorrow, that actually you could get those resources that you actually need to do the project. You'd probably end up on a waiting list, in truth.
I want to encourage everyone to follow Jim Liddle, okay, for more information, for really contacting the experts on his team and to find out what are your business needs over here. So we're having this discussion just to excite you, to enlighten you, hopefully, right, with the knowledge that Jim is so generously sharing with us. We hear about all the possibilities now with AI. At the same time, right, what kind of data sources do you find most valuable? That it still takes resources and effort and investment to utilize all the data that enterprise possesses. So what are the good strategies and best practices around that?
Well, I think that's true. I think it's true that it's particularly for an enterprise, it's more difficult to actually put themselves in a position to leverage their data set. Typically an enterprise will, break down into two sources of data. They'll have structured data, and their structured data, potentially is much better understood than their unstructured data. Structured data, they'll probably have in certain repositories and databases, and perhaps even in some applications. Their unstructured data set will typically be stored, file-based or object-based, and typically it will be very large in size. Some of those unstructured data, lakes, repositories, can be petabytes in size. And the big challenge really for the enterprise is that data, typically is dark data. It's very difficult to understand which of that data set they want to leverage from an AI perspective. And actually, there's a challenge even before that in many cases, in that, part of the issue, especially with unstructured data that's stored, for example, on things like, file systems, is that typically it's split. It's not necessarily all on the same, solution. So you might have some on old Windows machines, you might have some on FTP repositories, you might have some on, legacy hardware or legacy NASs, and ultimately you're trying to figure out how you join that data set up to actually start to think about leveraging some of that data, from an AI perspective. Some of it's duplicative, some of it is just old and really needs to be archived. So there is really a data management aspect, first of all, to be able to coalesce those silos to get to a point where you have a consolidated, unstructured data set, at least, to be able to work with. And once you've done that, you really need to start thinking about, curating the data set at that point, figuring out which of that data is valuable to you from an AI perspective, and which isn't, and then you can start to think about how you can leverage that data inside of, you know, an AI solution, whether that is for things like, you know, fine tuning or model training, or whether that is more applicable to things like RAG-based systems, or whether it's simply to use inside of something like Azure AI Search, so that you can actually get more visibility into the data set.
About people in this equation, all right? Because I hear about new emerging roles, some of them established, right? Like chief digital officer is nothing new news anymore, right? There are new, absolutely leadership roles out there. Chief AI officer, right? Chief innovation, right? You are leading innovation, right, in your organization. So point is how these new roles helping out rather than intervening and adding another level of management complexity, you think?
Yeah, well, I think there's, you know, the introduction of AI into an enterprise is interesting at a number of levels. I think in terms of the roles, I think what's interesting to me is that you don't just invest in one person from a kind of, I call it data intelligence. You know, I know we talk about AI, but there are different facets of AI. You've got the more traditional machine learning data scientists, and which have a big part to play, you know, from an AI perspective. And then you've got, you know, people who are probably, you know, more up to date with more modern, you know, AI techniques, such as some of those foundational models and, you know, some of those RAG patterns. And you kind of need both, to be honest with you, inside of an enterprise. It's not just one role. And also you need, obviously, somebody who's looking at a much higher level than that, who's looking at the strategy for the business. And that should be both outbound facing, if they're a product company, and also inbound facing in terms of how they can leverage AI internally in their own business, you know, not just what they can do in their product set. That's pretty much what actually we're doing in Nasuni. We're looking internally and we're looking at externally. We're looking at both. And then, of course, there is the element of AI that you can leverage in a business that, you know, that you can get from vendors you already work with. And that's a quick way to get some quick wins, particularly if it's been embedded inside of some of those vendor tools. And then I would say there's the cultural aspect of AI inside of a company. What does AI mean to me? You know, does it mean I'm going to lose my job? What does it mean, you know, when my company starts to embrace some of these AI tools? And you know, the way I like to look at least at AI is that AI is very good at perhaps automating mundane, repetitive processes, and often those mundane, repetitive processes are not the best things to work on anyway from a people perspective. So I like to think of AI as, you know, automating some of those processes and allowing people in the enterprise to work on more interesting things. And I think that culturally, you know, organizations need to bring their people along so that they understand, you know, what AI means internally and what it's going to mean for their roles too.
Cannot agree more. Absolutely right. We're here discussing with my guest, you know, what's the easiest way, what's the best way on both technology, people, and as well as processes side, right? Because it's always a transformation. There's no easy way to just introduce a new tool, because otherwise you will be stuck with legacy applications that just sit, you know, in a separate bucket and the separate management system. So we know how that works. So something exciting over there, meaning that people wanting to ease their jobs. We don't like mundane tasks, right? What's a good kind of message to those enterprise leaders at all level, all the way like from team leaders on business side, on technical side, engineers, but at the same time customer facing? What's a good message in a way that starting small, vetoing on the tool, all right, and hearing people who will be working with that tool? That's like Irene 101, you know, change management solution. What's
I agree totally. I mean, with the use cases at the end of the day, you shouldn't be retrofitting use cases so that they fit into AI. You should be looking at your use cases and understanding which of those lend themselves well to be automated. And I actually think about AI as, in many ways, AI is the next generation of business process automation for the enterprise. I know we talk a lot about AI this and AI that, but from an enterprise perspective, it's really about automating some of those business processes, and to do that, leveraging the underlying data, which becomes a big part of an enabler really for those business processes to be automated. And I remember going back, back 20 years, when we were doing business rules and business process automation to achieve something similar. Actually, we were using WSDL endpoints, with business process ML to try and automate, interactions with systems and with people. And, we even had the term human in the loop inside of those business processes, which we kind of use today from an AI perspective. And I do think that, when you look at it from an enterprise perspective, the message to a lot of those business leaders should be, AI can be transformative for sure. It can be transformative for the business. It can be transformative for the people in the business. But you're very right. You need to be looking at it the right way, not just doing AI for AI's sake. It's because you have use cases that really fit well and can be automated, and you can leverage, the AI systems to do that. And the other thing I would say around that is, just because it's been done in a certain way with people in the past doesn't mean you should really think about replicating that entire process end to end with AI. It might not be the same process from an AI perspective. You should be able to optimize it in a much different way. And that requires perhaps a different mindset. It's not just looking at how the people did it and then trying to replicate that with the AI system. It's looking at how the business process can be automated most efficiently with these new tools that we now have at our disposal.
Back on that business value, all right? Because in the end, somebody has to convince someone in organization, right, that this is the way to go. And they have to demonstrate, they have to prove the success, right, at every stage of the initiative. So what are your thoughts about best way to demonstrate ROI, best way to convince people, of course, when it's feasible, right? We're not just talking technology for technology's sake.
Sure. I mean, I think like a lot of initiatives, AI has both a hard ROI and a soft ROI. And I think that the hard ROI, you can figure out what those are. You can increase sales, you can cut costs, and there will certainly be some AI initiatives where you can absolutely demonstrate that. If you're leveraging a front-end sales chatbot that is helping you answer questions quicker and perhaps even move your stock quicker, you can see how that can be easily demonstrated from an ROI case. Similarly for support, from a support perspective, if you're no longer adding heads in support, but you have virtual assistants who are fulfilling the same job, it's got a very hard ROI case. Some of the softer ROI cases, are maybe things like we talked about earlier, the institutional knowledge use case. If it takes you an hour to find something or longer, the fact that you can interact with an AI system and have your question answered in 5 minutes or even 30 seconds, how demonstrable is that from an ROI perspective? It's hard to demonstrate. It has a very soft ROI, but it does lead to better efficiencies inside of the business. And I do think that, when you're thinking about some of these AI use cases, they will fall out into, these are hard ROI use cases. They're really demonstrable to the business. I can build my business case. And I have some of these softer, AI use cases, and they're going to be really more difficult, to demonstrate from a hard ROI perspective. However, some of those softer, use cases or softer ROIs, they might be some of the ones that are more easier to get into, such as that knowledge use case, where you can actually get to grips with some of the AI tools and really ease your way into some of those harder ROI use cases.
About some success stories, okay? You don't have to name client name or anything like that, right? But just an example of like inspiring story where, hey, AI initiative brought the results, brought the satisfaction to the team implementing, and of course, business value to the company.
Yeah, we obviously have some of those. An interesting one is we just released something called our S3 Edge technology, which allows people who want to get access to our file system through the S3 protocol, so they get it as object rather than file. And a manufacturing company was able to leverage that so that they could actually scale up their manufacturing process, which was basically taking taking snapshots or pictures of their manufacturing of product, and then feeding that back into an ML system to train it. And they got a really big increase in being able to do that, simply by having one of the edge filers locally off cloud, not having to programmatically change some of their S3, implementation code, so that they could leverage that S3 edge. And then, it kind of was going in as object, and then they were leveraging it back in the AI system as file, and it was kind of a round trip. But it worked really, really well, and they got a real scale element out of it. So that's kind of one example. We've got other examples of customers who are basically that knowledge use case is a big use case. We have a lot of customers who want to attack that. So the ability to be able to create AI pipelines, pull out, for example, PDF documents that have certain words in them, such as contracted dates and months, pull them all the way through into something like Azure AI Search, where they can tag and curate them and then make them available inside of some of these chatbots. That's another very, very common use case.
Fantastic. Time is flying, Jim. I'm enjoying this conversation immensely. All right. I cannot not ask you about lesson learned. Okay. What are the best practices? Something that you tried, something that your team experienced, and something that you'd like to share with our audience, lesson learned from all the implementations?
So we do a lot of prototyping in-house. Not all those prototypes make it out into the wild, and some of those prototypes are simply to understand how our customers might be using some of our products. So I as part of that, I built a RAG app, a retrieval augmented generation app. The purpose of that app was to be able to store a multitude of documents that you could interact with, and as part of implementing that application, I learned a lot. I learned a lot of what I would call, whether I would call them best practices or not, I don't know, because I think the technology moves so quickly. But what I did learn going through that process is I started off, with that on Pinecone as the vector DB, and then eventually moved to, MongoDB Alpha. And one of the reasons for that, was when you start to work with, lots of documents in kind of a RAG app, it's nice to be able to have that hybrid search, where not only do you have the vector search and doing cosine similarity, but also you can start to narrow down maybe some of that document set using traditional BM25 keyword search. So that was, a journey and an understanding. But still, even, using that, what you find when you start to build those RAG apps is that making sure that the cosine similarity matches, match the prompt that you're ultimately trying to, you're using to try and gather the knowledge can still be a challenge. And I think in those instances, you need to start thinking about using, re-rankers, such as like Cohere's re-ranker, so that that gets you an even narrower focus in terms of how you can make sure that you get the right answer from the AI system. Prompt augmentation, I figured out, helps a lot as well. When you augment the prompt on the way through with the AI system, experimenting with that can make a big difference in terms of what the result set looks like. So there's a lot of, I would say there's a lot of things that, people can learn from just by implementing those from scratch end to end, and working with like a test data set and some test questions, to actually refine, their system so that it actually is as, on point as it can be for their use case.
Fantastic, Jim. Yeah, thank you so very much. Again, thank you for your time, for sharing wisdom with our audience. In conclusion, okay, I would like to ask you about few takeaways, because we did talk about data insights. We talk about the implementing AI initiative, even roles in the organization, and of course, considerations that technical and business leaders have to have in mind when attempting the journey, of course, in use cases. So in conclusion, what maybe few takeaways you want to share to remember this conversation by?
Yeah, I would say in terms of sound bites, I think a big takeaway is, and I mentioned it earlier, I think if you want to have a successful long-term AI strategy, then underpinning that, you really need a good data strategy. That is the key to success, to AI success, is to have a good data strategy. And there's a number of ways to do that. You need to do a data evaluation of your estate, particularly your unstructured data sets. You need to think about collapsing the silos and coalescing those, so you get to like the single source of truth, the single source of knowledge that that AI requires. And then you need to really focus on curation, of that data, so that ultimately it puts you in a good place to be able to use those data sets with some of those AI solutions. I think that a lot of companies, I think one of the things that AI has shown us is that this thing around, and I'm sure in your career you've seen it so many times, data management strategies. A lot of companies in the past have tried and failed, or it's there's not been a big enough catalyst to want to make that work. I think AI is the catalyst to have to go through that journey.
Exactly. Excellent point, actually. AI, not just as an innovation goal, but AI as a driver to revisit data management, to improve data management, right? Which will benefit the companies just on its own, right? Even if AI initiative not being deployed, right? So wow, that's
totally agree. Not just from an AI perspective, but all sorts of other organizational perspectives.
Absolutely. Wow. I encourage everyone again. So follow Jim Liddle, follow SaugaTalks. We're going to be releasing shorter snippets of this conversation. So hopefully you'll find it valuable. Jim, thank you so very much for your time today. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.